we're going to unpack the real story behind one of the biggest fortunes in tech history. And I'll give you a hint. The company that actually made Steve Jobs a billionaire, well, it's probably not the one you're thinking of. All right, let's just start with a simple question. When you think of Steve Jobs and all of his wealth, what's the first company that pops into your head? It's an easy one, right? So, you're probably thinking Apple. I mean, it's the obvious answer, but it's actually wrong. The company that officially gave him the title of billionaire wasn't the one he famously co-founded in a garage. To really get why that is, we first need to look at the sheer scale of his wealth and kind of bust the myth that so many of us believe about where all that money came from. By the time he passed away in 2011, Steve Jobs' net worth was a staggering $10.2 billion. Just let that sink in for a second. That put him in the league of the wealthiest people on the entire planet. And look, it makes total sense why we'd think that. His name and Apple are basically one and the same. But the real source of the bulk of his fortune, well, that's a completely different story. And it actually starts with a pretty bitter ending. Yeah, the real story here doesn't start with some big success. It kicks off with a massive failure, a really painful breakup from the company he poured his heart and soul into creating. I mean, Jobs was Apple. He was the visionary, the guy who guided this incredible rocket ship of a company through the late 70s and early 80s. But then, in a wild turn of events, a power struggle with the board and the very CEO he had personally recruited, John Scully, got him kicked out. In 1985, he was ousted from his own company. So what was the big fight all about? Well, it really boiled down to two totally different ideas for where Apple should go. Jobs was all about pushing the envelope, chasing these huge, radical, super expensive passion projects. Scully and the board, they were way more focused on, paying the bills, making products that were commercially viable and would keep the company stable. So can you imagine? You're kicked out of the company you built from the ground up. Jobs felt completely betrayed, and he made a huge, dramatic move in protest. He sold off nearly his entire stake in Apple. He sold everything, all but one single share. Now, why would he do that? Why hang on to just one? It definitely wasn't for the money. It was pure strategy. It was his way of staying in the game. That one share was his ticket to get into the annual shareholder meetings. It meant he could still show up, still have a voice, and, as he put it, cause a fuss. It was his way of making sure they could never forget him. All right, so that closes one chapter. Let's get into what he did next, because this is where he takes this huge gamble on a new venture that honestly sounded like something straight out of science fiction at the time. So, right after getting pushed out of Apple, Jobs discovers this tiny, super ambitious company that was a perfect match for his own love of the impossible. It was a little computer graphics team, an offshoot from Lucasfilm, and they had this insane goal: to one day make an entire feature-length movie completely on a computer. But turning that dream into reality, that was a long, long game, and a super expensive one. The technology simply wasn't powerful enough yet. So Jobs had to personally bankroll the whole thing. Over the years, he slowly poured more than $50 million of his own money into the company, just to keep the lights on while they all waited for computer power to finally catch up to their big idea. And here's what's so fascinating about this. For Jobs, this wasn't just a financial bet. I mean, yeah, he thought it could be a good investment, but it was also personal. You could even call it a vendetta. This was his chance to prove Apple's board wrong and build the kind of company that focused on visionary, long-term tech that they just didn't get. So after a decade of waiting, a decade of patience, and dumping millions of his own dollars into the stream, that huge bet was finally about to pay off. And I mean pay off in a monumental way. And then, boom, the mid-90s hit and technology finally got there. Pixar released its very first feature film, Toy Story, and it was an absolute game changer, a total smash hit. It didn't just prove their idea could work, it completely redefined the future of animation forever. By 2006, after a whole string of massive hits, we're talking Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, their partner Disney decided they just had to own the whole thing. The price tag? An absolutely astounding $7.4 billion. Okay, but here is the most critical detail of the entire deal, the part that changes everything. This wasn't a cash buyout. Disney paid for the whole thing entirely in Disney stock, and that one little detail would fundamentally reshape Steve Jobs' financial world forever. With that one transaction, just like that, Steve Jobs became the single largest individual shareholder in the Walt Disney Company. And that, right there, is the moment he officially became a billionaire. Not because of Apple, but because of Pixar. So let's bring this whole story full circle. Let's see how it all added up at the end of his life, especially after he made that famous, triumphant return to Apple.
Of course, we all know the next part of the story. He came back to an Apple that was on the brink of bankruptcy and led one of the greatest corporate turnarounds in history, with the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, the whole shebang. And for that, he was rewarded with billions in Apple stock.
But, and this is the amazing part, even after all of that historic success, take a look at this. When he passed away in 2011, the value of his Disney shares, the ones he got from that Pixar deal, was still worth significantly more than his stock in Apple. The company born from his lowest professional moment became the true foundation of his immense wealth. Which leaves us with a final, kind of wild thought. His investment in Pixar was driven, at least in part, by a personal vendetta against the company that fired him. So it really makes you wonder, can a grudge actually be a good investment? It seems that sometimes, when you channel that kind of energy into something truly visionary, it can end up changing absolutely everything.